From Betch Correia, who trash-talked her way into a fight with the UFC legend Ronda Rousey, to Conor McGregor, who was utterly crushed by Nate Diaz. Here are all the UFC fighters who learned the hard way that trash talk can backfire. Let's start with Betch Correia versus Ronda Rousey. From her early days in the UFC, Betch wanted a fight with bantamweight title holder Ronda Rousey, and she went about it by trash-talking and provoking the champion repeatedly. After she taunted Rousey one too many times and beat her teammates, Jessamyn Duke and Shayna Baszler, she ended up succeeding in getting a fight. In the pre-fight build-up, Betch took her trash talk to a whole new level. She told Combat that she wanted to knock Rowdy out, humiliate her, and show the world that she has no mixed martial arts skills. Ouch! In the same interview, Betch also crossed a line and made a few comments about Ronda's mental health. Getting deeply personal about an opponent is pretty distasteful. Ronda was incredibly angry hearing these comments. It was way below the belt. Betch didn't back off though. She embraced her bad girl persona and even taunted Rousey at the pre-fight stare-downs, telling her repeatedly not to cry. Ronda had already promised to get payback in the ring, and oh boy did she live up to her word. Within just 34 seconds, she'd knocked Correia out and coolly walked past her opponent who was still on the ground. This time, Ronda was the one who told her opponent not to cry. Solid burn, Rowdy. This was a pretty good example of when trash talk backfired.
Ronda with the knee now. Betch Correia's in big trouble. It's all over. Just like that. Oh my goodness. Again. Oh my goodness.
But not as good as Luke Rockhold versus Michael Bisping at UFC 199. Luke had already dominated Michael on the route to a win by submission 2 years before this, so he was convinced that the English mixed martial arts fighter stood no chance against him at UFC 199. Luke boldly predicted that this was going to be Bisping's swan song. He said this fight would be the end of him and claimed that he'd go out there and dominate the guy like he'd never been before. Whoa.
I know that I'm better than this.
Sounds like
I
the
know
worst
that I'm gonna
self-help
knock him
book
out.
you've ever read. Conceive, believe, achieve. Shut the f*** up. Listen.
Yeah.
You're talking like you're like this dominant champion.
I guess somebody had high hopes going into this fight. Rocky was honestly getting a bit too arrogant, and his fans could see that. But that didn't stop him from thinking the bout was going to be a one-sided affair. At the presser before the fight, Rockhold insulted Michael, calling him an average bloke and telling him he was going to knock him out. Even though at the time of the fight, the English professional fighter was still an underdog, he surprised everyone by knocking Rocky out in the very first round and taking the middleweight crown from him. Good for you, Bisping.
Had that chin up early. He goes body and then over the top with the left. Rocked Luke, he got right back up. Michael stayed in the face, right over the top with another left.
Another fighter that didn't let anyone trash talk him is Nate Diaz. Oh yeah, Conor McGregor versus Nate Diaz at UFC 196 was a fun one. The lightweight champ, Rafael dos Anjos, dropped out of his fight with the Notorious, and Nate Diaz was drafted on short notice in his place. Conor didn't even flinch, even though it meant the fight would have to take place at the welterweight level. Instead, he started ruthlessly ripping into his opponent. He said that the only approach he changed is that he dug the grave a little bit wider so Nate's body would fit in it. That's kind of dark, McGregor. He taunted Diaz's tough guy personality and laughed at him a good few times before the fight even took place.
I don't know. Say it like it is, Nate. Really, who gives a f? Is this the Money Channel? Who the f is this shit? I told you to take 5.
Absolutely did.
It looked like the Notorious was all set to win, but things didn't go according to plan on the night of the fight. The Irish fighter started off strong, but soon all his bravado from before the fight began to slip away. Nate took Conor's best shots and kept standing. By the time the second round came along, Nate had taken over the fight and was tagging Conor repeatedly on the feet. He seized on the Irishman's failed attempt to take him down and took the fight to the floor. The bout ended with a rear naked choke submission, and just like that, Nate handed McGregor his very first UFC loss.
My goodness! Now he's got the back! Now! That's it! He's got the choke! Nate Diaz! He has done it! It is all over! Nate Diaz!
I'm not gonna lie, it was pretty fun to see the Notorious finally getting taken down, but not as fun as when Chael Sonnen's holier-than-thou comments about Wanderlei Silva blew up in his face. Put on your seatbelts, guys, because this incident is downright crazy. By the time the two fighters were set to fight inside the octagon, they were straight-up mortal enemies. So when it came out that Wanderlei had been pulled from the fight, his arch-nemesis couldn't wait to taunt him about it. Chael said that the Brazilian-American fighter had operated his entire career under the shadow of suspicion that he was using performance-enhancing substances. He made fun of the fact that Silva had run when they came to his gym to test him. Of course, Chael was no saint himself. He'd previously served a one-year suspension after he'd tested positive for testosterone, but that didn't stop him from putting his foe on blast. The American gangster told Combat that he thought Wanderlei would never fight again. However, soon after, his comments and taunts blew up in his face, because as it turned out, Chael also ended up failing a pre-fight drug test. Even though he denied it, the American grappling expert tested positive for EP, HCG, and HGH, which led to him being suspended for 2 whole years. He was also removed from his UFC and Fox Sports broadcasting job responsibilities. Yikes! I guess someone needs to practice what he preaches, huh? He was known as the People's Champion, and it's safe to say that the people were pretty disappointed in him, especially since he'd been quite outspoken about his disdain for fighters who used PEDs. This incident tarnished his legacy and put a stain on his reputation that was hard to remove. Still, it wasn't as bad as when the Polish fighter Joanna Jędrzejczyk got beat up by Rose Namajunas. This was a classic example of trash talk backfiring. Joanna was the longtime women's strawweight champion, and she mercilessly tried to engage in mind games with Rose at UFC 217. The Polish MMA fighter told her opponent that she didn't think she was mentally strong. She went on to call Rose mentally unstable and broken, and even said that she'd never become a champion.
You know what? I will take your soul. You don't know shit about being a champion and you're never gonna be a champion. I give you no chance. For the first time I will face someone like me. Believe me, I'm taking your soul with me.
Okay.
Joanna was dead set on breaking the American fighter as soon as they got into the octagon. Thug didn't take the bait though, instead saying that maybe Joanna was right, and what made her such a great fighter was that she was crazy as hell. Either way, the Polish fighter continued to hound Rose every chance she got. To her credit, the American fighter took her opponent's taunts with grace and dignity, and then fight night came around. Rose stunned Joanna by beating her time and time again until she was on the floor. The Polish MMA fighter got back up, but Rose threw her back onto the ground within a few moments. The finish came barely 3 minutes into the fight.
Oh, Rose! Oh! Another knockdown! Rose Namajunas trying to close the show!
She was doing a great job of feinting.
That's
It's over!
And Rose took the title from Joanna, ending her long reign over it. Thug for the win. This was a pretty decent show of power on Rose's part, but not as great as when TJ Dillashaw beat Cody Garbrandt at UFC 217. Before the fight took place, the tension between the two former teammates was at an all-time high. At one point, Cody lost his temper and grabbed his opponent around the throat. He was also frequently boasting about flooring Dillashaw during training. Despite all that, when fight night finally came around, TJ was able to send Cody reeling to the ground with a head kick, which he followed up with a right hook when his opponent tried to rise. Soon, Dillashaw beat the American fighter with a TKO and earned the bantamweight crown. Anyway, that's everything on all the times trash talk backfired in the UFC.